Housing and Disability, a brief explanation of a complicated protected class, a production of Southwest Fair Housing Council. Federal fair housing laws establish that there are 7 protected classes. These classes include race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and lastly, disability. Please note, the housing provider is required by law to keep all information about disability confidential. Disability is perhaps one of the more complicated classes in fair housing. So who is considered disabled according to the FHAA? In 1988, the FHAA came up with 3 definitions for disability. The first one defines disability as a person with a physical, sensory, or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life function. The phrase physical, sensory, or mental impairment includes, but is not limited to, such diseases and chronic conditions as cancer, heart disease, HIV/AIDS, lupus, epilepsy, emotional illnesses, and others. By substantially limits, we mean any condition that significantly limits one's ability to perform one of life's major functions. These major functions are defined by the FHA as being of central importance to living daily life, such as the following. Please note, this list is not exhaustive. The other 2 ways the Fair Housing Act defines disability are an individual with a record of such an impairment, and an individual that is treated as though they have a disability even though they do not. That is, a person who is perceived as being disabled. Currently, disability is the number 1 category for housing discrimination claims in the state of Arizona and nationwide. Now that we understand how the FHA defines people with disabilities, we can delve into what people with disabilities are entitled to. People who are defined as disabled under fair housing laws are entitled to ask for 2 things in the context of housing: reasonable accommodations and modifications. According to the FHAA, these modifications and accommodations are necessary for the disabled person to fully enjoy his or her dwellings and the common areas in his or her respective housing units. How does the FHA define reasonable? Determining reasonability involves 2 steps. First, a housing provider must verify that the individual is indeed disabled. While a housing provider is entitled to obtain information that is necessary to evaluate a request, providers cannot outright ask what a person's disability is. They can only ask the nature of the disability. If a person's disability is obvious or otherwise known to the provider, and if the need for the requested accommodation is also readily apparent or known, then the provider may not request any additional information. An example of this may be a person in a wheelchair asking for a ramp to be installed, or a person receiving Social Security disability income asking for a flexible rent arrangement. If the disability is not obvious or readily visible, the housing provider may request only information about the nature of the disability. This is called verification. Providers have the right to ask for proof of one's disability from a healthcare provider, or they can ask for proof of one's disability benefits. Examples of healthcare providers include physicians, nurses, psychologists, and non-medical service agencies, people who are case managers, social workers, peer support group specialists, even a parent. Any reliable third party who is in a position to know about the individual's disability may provide verification of a disability. Moving on to step 2. Once the individual's disability has been verified, then housing providers must examine whether or not the requested accommodation or modification is actually connected to the disability. In other words, is there a correlation between the request and the person's disability? If the disability and request are clearly related, then you move to step 3, grant the request. A modification is a change to the structure of a dwelling, like grab bars or lowered cabinetry. A common question people have when talking about modifications and granting them is, who pays for these changes? The answer to this question is linked to another simple question. Is the property federally funded? Yes or no? If the provider receives federal funds, they may be responsible for the cost of the modification, as long as it is deemed reasonable and does not pose an undue financial burden. However, if the property is not federally funded, that is, it is privately owned, then the individual requesting the modification is responsible for the costs. Know that if the resident is paying for the modification, a property owner cannot require the individual to hire a specific contract. The property owner can, however, ask that the work be done in a professional and work-like manner. Reasonable accommodations are generally more involved and complicated than their counterparts. They involve changes to policies or procedures. Any accommodation that poses an undue financial burden to the housing provider or fundamentally changes the business of a particular provider may be deemed unreasonable and thus denied. An example of an undue financial burden may be a request to install an elevator for an individual in a wheelchair. Other examples of accommodations include the following. One of the more common requests involves assistive animals. Please stay tuned for our upcoming video exclusively dedicated to what we call qualified animals. Know that, however, any animal deemed to be necessary to helping a person with a disability to live and enjoy their lives and dwellings may be allowed. An individual with a disability may be denied the request for accommodation or modification if he or she is not defined as having a disability, their request is not linked to their disability, or the request poses an undue financial burden for the housing provider, or is not within the scope of the services provided by the business. However, if a request is denied, both parties should know the problem itself is not going away. Both parties should discuss whether there is an alternative accommodation that would effectively address the requester's disability-related needs. This interactive process can be helpful to all. Remember, the fair housing laws do not require that a housing provider adopt any formal procedures for reasonable accommodation and modification requests. However, having a written formal procedure may help individuals with disabilities in making requests and may assist housing providers assess those requests so that there are no misunderstandings. For more information on disability or about fair housing more generally, please contact us. The best way to communicate with us is via email. Please go to the link below to fill out an email. Make sure you provide us with details of your question. We also have a toll-free phone number for those who cannot email. Know that we are not a legal entity and thus cannot provide any legal advice. We are a resource for people seeking information and referrals. Finally, if you want to learn more about fair housing and disability, check out our free trainings. Contact us at training@swfhc.com.